The snow fell hard that morning, thick and relentless, swallowing every sound in the small town of Evergreen Hollow. What was once a charming valley of pine and laughter now looked like a frozen graveyard. Frost clung to every window. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down like an unspoken curse. Clara Bennett stood in the middle of Main Street, with nothing but a worn-out suitcase in her hand and the ache of humiliation in her chest. Her breath came out in fragile clouds as the townsfolk watched from behind frosted glass. Whispers followed her like shadows. "That's the one," a woman muttered to her friend by the bakery window. "The Bennett girl, the barren one." Clara pretended not to hear. Her father's voice was still ringing in a head sharp, final, unforgiving. "You've brought shame to this house. A woman who can't give life brings only death." He hadn't looked at her when he said it. He just stood by the doorway, his jaw tight, his Bible on the table like a weapon. When the doctor confirmed what the town already loved to gossip about, that Clara couldn't have children, her father didn't even wait for the snowstorm to pass. He told her to pack. He told her to leave, and he told her she would not be coming back. Now, standing at the edge of town, Clara's fingers trembled around the suitcase handle. Her boots sank into the snow, half buried already. The cold bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the hollow ache spreading through her chest. Then came the sound, the low rumble of an old pickup truck crawling up the icy road. It stopped a few feet from her, engine hissing against the cold. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man built like he'd wrestled the mountains themselves. Jack Donovan, the people called him, though few dared to. He was a veteran, a man who'd come back from wars that no one in Evergreen Hollow ever mentioned aloud. Broad shoulders under a flannel coat, face marked with scars time couldn't smooth out, and eyes cold as the steel sky. Clara's father appeared from behind her, boots crunching in the snow. He clutched a small envelope in his rough hand, the same hands that had once held her when she was a child. "Donovan," her father said, voice cutting through the wind. "She can work, cook, clean, whatever you need. Just keep her out of sight." Jack didn't move. He just stared at Clara long enough that she felt her heart twist under his gaze, not out of fear, but because he wasn't looking through her like everyone else. He was looking at her. Her father shoved the envelope into his coat pocket. "She brings bad luck," he muttered, as if to make sure the curse stuck even after she was gone. Jack's reply came quiet, gravel deep. "I don't believe in luck." He turned to Clara, his voice roughened by years of war and silence. "You coming or not?" For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Part of her wanted to scream, to beg her father to take it back, to tell her she still mattered. But he had already turned away, walking back toward the house without a glance. So she nodded. Clara climbed into the passenger seat, clutching her suitcase on her lap. The door creaked shut beside her. The warmth of the truck's heater was faint, but real, more mercy than she'd felt in years. As the truck rolled out of town, Clara looked back through the frostbitten window. The outline of her home, white, silent and cruel, faded into the storm. The porch light flickered once before disappearing completely. That was the moment she realized she wasn't just leaving home. Home had left her long ago. Inside the cab, silence ruled. Jack kept his eyes on the road, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near the dog lying in the back seat, a massive German shepherd, its ears twitching at every sound. "Named Ranger," Jack muttered after a while, catching Clara's glance. "Doesn't like strangers much." Ranger opened one eye, then let out a low, quiet huff, not aggressive but cautious. "Neither do I," Clara whispered, for the first time, a flicker of something, not quite a smile, but close goes to the cross Jack's face. They drove in silence after that. The snow thickened, the world behind them vanished. Clara pressed her forehead against the cold glass and whispered, almost to herself, "Is this freedom or punishment?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't have to. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, two strangers, each haunted by a war of their own, began a journey neither of them had asked for, yet both somehow needed. And as Evergreen Hollow disappeared behind them, Clara Bennett finally stopped trying to hold back her tears. For the first time in her life, she let them fall. The snowstorm hadn't let up. The world outside the truck was a blur of white, the kind that swallowed everything: road, trees, sky, even time itself. The wipers studded in slow, heavy beats. Each turn of the mountain road felt like a small act of faith. Jack Donovan drove with both hands on the wheel, jaw tight, eyes locked ahead. He hadn't spoken since they left Evergreen Hollow, not one word. The only sound in the cab came from the old radio static, then the faint hum of a country song decades too old for the modern world. "Cold, cold heart," Hank Williams crooned softly, like a ghost in the static. In the back seat, Ranger lifted his head. The dog's gaze met Clara's through the rearview mirror. Sharp, intelligent, assessing, his ears perked, his muscles tense, as if he was still on duty somewhere far from here. Clara offered him a small smile. "You've seen more kindness than I have, haven't you?" she whispered. Ranger blinked once, slow and calm, before resting his head back down. It felt, strangely, like an answer. Jack's voice broke the silence, rough like gravel dragged across steel. "He doesn't trust easy." Clara jumped slightly. She hadn't expected him to speak. "Neither do I," she replied before she could stop herself. Jack didn't look at her, didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched like he almost did. The truck climbed higher into the mountain range. Pines lined the narrow path, their branches heavy with snow. The sky darkened as the last light faded behind the ridges. For a moment, Clara wondered if they were driving into the heart of nowhere. Finally, Jack turned onto a narrow trail barely visible beneath the snow. The truck groaned as it pushed through, tires crunching over frozen ground. Then, through the trees, she saw a cabin, half buried under white. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney. The wooden porch sagged a little, but the place looked steady, safe, even. Jack killed the engine. Silence dropped heavy and immediate. He stepped out first, boots sinking deep. The wind tore across the ridge, biting through coats and skin alike. Clara opened her door, clutching her suitcase, and nearly lost her balance when the gust hit her. Jack caught her arm firm, not gentle, but enough to steady her. "Watch your step," he muttered. She nodded, breath clouding in the cold. Ranger leaped out behind them, landing in the snow with the practiced grace of an old soldier. He shook himself off, then trotted ahead toward the porch, tail low but wagging once, as if claiming the ground. Jack pointed toward the cabin. "This is it," he said simply, "where you'll stay." Clara looked at him, unsure if he meant the cabin or his life. He opened the door and stepped aside. "Rules are simple," he said. "Don't ask questions. Don't touch what's not yours. You do your work, you stay warm, you'll be fine." She nodded again, though her throat felt tight. "And if I'm not fine?" Jack's eyes met hers, cold and unflinching. "You will be inside." The air was dry and smelled faintly of pine and old woods. The cabin was tidy to the point of obsession. Tools hung perfectly straight on the wall. Boots lined up under a bench, not a speck of dust on the table. There were no photos, no laughter, no hint of life beyond survival. It felt more like a memorial than a home. Clara set her suitcase down by the door. Her fingers were stiff from cold. She wanted to ask where to sleep, but Jack was already shrugging off his coat and hanging it on a nail. Ranger lay by the fireplace, his amber eyes tracking every movement she made. "You live here alone?" she asked quietly. Jack didn't answer right away. He knelt by the hearth, tossing in a few pieces of dry wood. The fire crackled to life, filling the cabin with a dim, amber glow. "Most people can't stand silence," he said finally. "I got used to it." Clara hugged her coat tighter around her. The flames reflected in her eyes, but they didn't reach the sadness behind them. "Silence doesn't scare me," she murmured. "It's the things I hear inside it that do." Jack's hand froze for a second. The only sound was the hiss of the fire. Then he dropped another log in. "You're cold," he said, his tone shifting quieter, almost kind. "Sit closer." She hesitated, then did as told. Her hands stretched toward the warmth. The heat seeped into her skin, thawing the numbness in her fingers, and, for the first time in days, the trembling in her heart eased. Jack stood, brushing the ash from his palms. "There's food in the cupboard, water from the pump outside. You'll find spare blankets in the back room." Clara looked up at him. "You really don't talk much, do you?" His expression didn't change. Talking never fixed anything. And with that, he crossed the room, opened the door to what must have been his bedroom, and disappeared inside. The door clicked shut. The silence returned thick, heavy, but not empty. The fire popped softly, shadows dancing on the walls. Ranger's breathing filled the space like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Clara stared at the flames, her thoughts drifting back to the town, to her father's words, to the cold faces that had watched her leave. She didn't know what waited for her here, but for the first time in a long time, she felt safe, not happy, not even hopeful, but safe. She whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, whoever you really are." "Jack Donovan." Ranger lifted his head, as if he'd heard. He gave a low, approving rumble and lay back down. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the fire burned steady. And somewhere beyond the walls of that lonely cabin, the first fragile thread between two broken souls began to weave itself together. Morning came late in the mountains. The sun barely pierced the thick curtain of clouds, and the snow outside glowed faintly, turning the cabin's single window into a pale rectangle of light. Clara woke to silence, the kind that feels too still, like the world's holding its breath. The fire from last night had died down to faint embers. Ranger was already awake, lying by the hearth, his golden eyes open and alert. Jack was gone. The truck keys were gone from the hook, which meant he'd driven into town, probably for supplies. That was what she told herself, though she had no proof. She pushed herself up, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and looked around the cabin. Every surface gleamed with order. Everything had a place. It wasn't just tidiness. It was control, the kind of control people build when they've lost everything else. She decided to clean, though there wasn't much to clean. Maybe she wanted to earn her keep. Maybe she just needed something to do that wasn't thinking. She swept the floor, wiped the counter, dusted the mantel. The cabin smelled faintly of pine, soap, and smoke. It was peaceful until she reached the door at the end of the hallway. Jack's room. The door was half open, just enough for curiosity to whisper. Clara hesitated, her hand hovering near the frame. She knew better, but the silence pressed on her, heavy and intimate. She stepped inside. The room was simple, a narrow bed, a small desk, a trunk against the wall, everything perfectly arranged. But on top of the dresser, something caught her eye, a small wooden box, dark with age, its corners worn smooth by touch. A tiny lock held it closed. Her fingers brushed the lid. Something about it felt sacred. Still, she couldn't help it. She reached for the key and found it hanging on a nail above the desk. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt too loud for the quiet room. Inside lay a metal, heavy, bronze, with an eagle embossed at the center, the kind given to men who'd done things they never talked about. Next to it, an old photograph, edges cold from time. A woman with soft eyes holding a little boy, maybe 6 years old, both smiling, both alive in a way that filled the room with ghosts. Clara's breath caught. Beneath the photo lay a scrap of scorched fabric. Blackened around the edges, it looked like part of a uniform. She touched it gently, and for a moment, she swore she could still smell smoke. Put that down. The voice behind her was deep, cold. Clara froze. She turned. Jack stood in the doorway, his face a mask, unreadable. But his eyes, they burned. He stepped inside slowly, boots silent against the wood. Ranger appeared in the hole behind him, ears flattened, tail stiff, sensing the tension before it broke. I'm sorry, Clara stammered. I didn't mean to that, Jack said, voice low. Isn't your business. His tone wasn't loud, but it hit harder than any shout. Clara took a step back. I was just cleaning. I didn't know you knew enough. He cut in. For a moment, they just stood there, the air between them heavy with unspoken things. Ranger padded into the room and came to her side. He looked up at her, then at Jack, and let out a small, low whine. Not fear, not warning, just sorrow. Clara looked down at him, and something inside her steadied. She whispered, I really am sorry, Jack. Jack's shoulders rose and fell once a slow exhale. He reached past her, closed the box, and snapped the lock shut. There are things you don't want to understand, he said finally. Leave them buried. He turned and walked out, the sound of his boots echoing down the hallway. Ranger stayed by Clara's side, pressing his nose to her hand. His fur was warm, grounding. She knelt down, whispering into his ear, I think your master's heart is heavier than this whole mountain, isn't it? The dog huffed softly, as if agreeing. That night, the storm returned. Snow pounded the windows, and wind howled across the ridge. The fire burned bright, but the cabin still felt cold. Jack had barely spoken since the incident. He'd eaten in silence, then gone to his room without a word. Clara sat by the fire with Ranger at her feet, watching the flames dance. She could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. Then came the sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, a low moan, rising and falling, but it grew louder, rawer. A voice. Jack's voice. He was shouting. Clara stood, her heart pounding. She walked down the hall and stopped outside his door. Nope. Get down, get. The words broke into a strangled cry, then silence, then another sound, the hollow thud of a fist hitting wood. Clara pushed the door open. Jack was sitting on the edge of his bed, drenched in sweat, eyes open but far away, trapped in a war she couldn't see. His hands trembled, clutching something invisible. Jack, she whispered. He didn't respond. Ranger padded forward, climbing onto the bed beside him. The dog pressed his head against Jack's arm and let out a soft, steady whine, the sound of loyalty that refuses to give up. Slowly, Jack blinked back to the present. His gaze met hers, disoriented, ashamed. You shouldn't be here, he said hoarsely. Neither should you, Clara replied gently. Not there, wherever that was. He looked away, breathing hot. For a long time, no one spoke. The storm outside raged, but inside, something fragile shifted, a fracture in the war between them. Clara reached for the blanket at the foot of the bed and draped it over his shoulders. Then she turned to leave. Just before she closed the door, Jack's voice followed her, rough, but softer than before. "Thank you." She paused, then whispered, "You're welcome." The door shut. The house settled back into silence. But the ghosts remained, some belonging to Jack, some to Clara, and some to both of them now. The days that followed were made of quiet, not peace quiet. Outside, the world was still buried in snow, the pines bending under white weight, the sky pale as bone. Inside, life settled into a rhythm that belonged to no one, yet somehow belonged to both of them. Jack chopped wood behind the cabin every morning, his axe rising and falling in steady rhythm. The sound echoed through the trees, a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Clara watched from the kitchen window sometimes, pretending she wasn't. She'd wash the dishes, hang damp clothes near the fire, or hum faint tunes just to fill the emptiness. Ranger often lingered near the door, splitting his loyalty between them, a silent messenger between two people who didn't quite know how to speak. They rarely talked. Words felt like fragile things here, as if one wrong sentence might break the truce they hadn't agreed upon. At night, she cooked stews, bread, sometimes just soup. Jack would sit at the small table, silent, eyes distant. He always thanked her, but never looked up for long. She noticed things. How he flinched when a log cracked too sharply in the fire. How he always left one light burning when he went to bed. How Ranger slept facing the door, as if guarding both of them from something that refused to die. The radio became her only company when Jack went out to the woods. A small, battered thing on the shelf, its antenna wrapped in electrical tape. She would tune in to the late-day broadcasts, weather updates, bits of news, the kind of static-filled chatter that kept a soul from feeling too alone. Sometimes, the station would play children's programs, little songs, laughter, voices so full of life they almost hurt to hear. And every time, without fail, Jack would stop whatever he was doing. If he was splitting wood, the axe froze mid-air. If he was sharpening tools, the blade paused. He wouldn't move, just listen. Clara caught it the first time by accident. She'd been kneeling by the stove, scrubbing a pan, when the giggling came through the radio, a boy and a girl reciting the alphabet, their laughter spilling through the static. Through the window, she saw Jack stand perfectly still, axe in hand, his breath visible in the cold air. Something in the moment tightened her chest. Later, she asked gently, "You okay out there?" He didn't answer. The next day, it happened again, and again the day after that. Each time, the laughter came and went like a ghost, and Jack froze, as if the sound reached somewhere deep, a wound no one could see. It was on the fourth evening that Clara finally asked. The radio played a soft tune, a lullaby, tender and old. The light in the cabin was low, the fire whispering in the grate. Jack sat at the table, oiling his rifle, his motions slow and precise. Clara dried her hands, hesitating. The question rose in her throat before she could stop it. "You had a child once, didn't you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the hush of the room it felt loud. Jack didn't move. His hands froze mid-motion for a long time. Only the faint pop of the fire answered. Then he set the rifle down and looked at her, really looked, as though weighing something invisible between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like gravel underfoot. "I did," he said. "Once." 2 words, that was all. But in those 2 words lived 1,000 stories and 1,000 graves. Clara wanted to ask more, but she saw the wall behind his eyes closing, so she nodded, softly, and turned back to the stove. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "Don't be," he said after a moment. "Just don't ask me to talk about it." "I won't." And that was it. The rest of the evening passed in the same uneasy quiet. The wind outside shifted, brushing against the windows like a restless spirit. Ranger stretched beside the hearth, ears flicking at every gust. Later, when Jack went to bed, Clara stayed awake by the fire, listening to the radio's faint hum. A children's choir sang somewhere beyond the static off-key. Innocent, she turned the dial down, then off, and stared into the darkened glass. In the reflection, she could see her own face, tired, older than she remembered, and behind her, the empty hallway where Jack had disappeared. For a moment, she thought she heard him again, that soft, broken voice from the night before, calling out in dreams he couldn't escape. She wanted to go to him, to say something that might reach across the silence, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered into the dim cabin, "We're all haunted by someone, aren't we?" Ranger lifted his head, gave a small sigh, then laid it back down on his paws. The fire burned low, and the house, that old wooden house full of ghosts, exhaled with them. The snow had softened by the time February came. turning the forest into a cathedral of light and breath. The air smelled clean pine, smoke, and thaw. That morning, Jack told Clara to bundle up. "You'll freeze out there if you don't," he muttered, handing her a pair of worn gloves. She followed him and Ranger into the trees, the crunch of their boots breaking the hush. It was the first time he'd invited her beyond the edge of the clearing. They didn't speak much. The forest did the talking, creaking branches, the far call of a hawk, the slow rhythm of Jack's axe as he split deadwood. Clara gathered kindling nearby, fingers numb but spirit strangely warm. At one point, Ranger bounded off, chasing his own breath in clouds of white. Jack called after him, voice lighter than she'd ever heard. "Ranger, you fool dog, get back here." Clara turned and saw it. The smile, not the polite curve she'd seen at dinner, but a real one. Quick, unguarded, almost boyish. It lit his whole face for an instant before vanishing beneath the usual armor of quiet. She caught herself smiling too. "He really listens to you," she said softly. "He's the only one who ever did," Jack replied, but the edge in his tone was gone. They spent the rest of the morning in companionable silence, working side by side. She carried the lighter logs while he hauled the heavy ones onto the sled. The air was crisp, the kind that bit but didn't wound. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara felt something close to calm, like the forest itself was breathing for her, filling the empty spaces inside. When they returned to the cabin near noon, she set a pot to boil while Jack stacked the fresh wood. Ranger sprawled on the porch, tongue lolling, content and tired. It felt almost like home. Then it happened. She reached for a mug on the shelf, Jack's old army mug, the one with faded letters, and her glove slipped. The cup shattered against the floor. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. Before she could even breathe, Jack spun around, hand flying to his sidearm. His eyes were wild, unfocused pupils blown wide with terror that didn't belong to this world. "Get down," he barked, voice hoarse, weapon half-drawn. Clara froze. Her pulse pounded so loud she could hear it in her ears. For a hot beat, they weren't in the cabin. He wasn't in Evergreen Hollow. He was somewhere else. Sand, smoke, screaming. Ranger barked sharply. Sensing the fracture, the sound snapped Clara out of her shock. She raised both hands slowly, voice soft but steady. "Jack, hey, it's just me." He didn't move. His chest heaved. The barrel trembled. "Jack, look at me," she whispered. "You're safe. No one's here. You're home." Something in the way she said home reached him. His eyes flicked to hers, confusion cutting through the haze. Then he blinked twice, and the gun lowered. Silence filled the space where the echo had been. He stared at the broken mug, then at his shaking hands, shame burning behind the exhaustion. He stopped, jaw tight. "I didn't mean." Clara stepped closer, slow, cautious, as if approaching a wounded animal. Then, without thinking too much, she reached out and took his hand. His skin was cold, the tremor still running beneath it. "It's okay," she murmured. "No one's hurt." Jack swallowed hard, unable to look at her. "Sometimes it just comes back. The noise, the dust. You don't forget. You don't have to explain." "I do," he said quietly. "You live here now. You deserve to know what kind of man you're around. A man who's been through hell and still keeps a fire burning." She said simply, "That's enough." Her words hung there, gentle but firm. Ranger moved closer, pressing his head against Jack's leg as if to agree. For the first time, Jack didn't pull away. He stood still, letting the warmth of both of them, woman and dog, steady his breath. Minutes passed before he finally exhaled, long and rough. "I guess I owe you a new mug," Clara said, half smiling, trying to ease the weight. Jack's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Guess you do," he said, when she turned to sweep up the glass. He bent beside her, helping wordlessly. Their hands brushed once, just a flicker, but something shifted, quiet and unmistakable. That evening, as the forest exhaled outside, they sat by the fire again. This time, Jack didn't sit across the room. He sat near her, his chair pulled just close enough for the glow to touch both faces. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, like the woods breathing, like something broken learning how to mend. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Inside, two people who had forgotten how to live began, unknowingly, to remember. The winter sun rose pale and slow, spilling gold across the frozen ridge. Clara woke to the faint smell of coffee and the soft thud of boots outside. Jack was already up. He always was. Ranger trotted past the window, his breath steaming in the cold. That morning, Clara decided the cabin needed something sweet, something that didn't smell like smoke and pine and solitude. She rolled up her sleeves and pulled out what she could find. Flour, sugar, a jar of honey half crystallized with age. When Jack came in, shaking off snow from his jacket. She looked up and said, almost shyly, I thought maybe I'd teach you something that doesn't involve chopping wood. He raised an eyebrow. That's so. Ever baked before? No ma'am. Closest I got was burning a ration pack in a camp stove. She laughed, a clear, easy sound that warmed the air more than the stove did. Then we start simple. Honey biscuits. My mother used to make them. Jack hesitated, then pulled off his gloves and joined her at the counter. His hands were large, rough, better suited for a rifle than a rolling pin. But he tried, careful, almost gentle. Flour dusted the sleeves of his flannel shirt. Clara watched the concentration in his face as he measured too much sugar, then looked at her for correction. That's a bit generous, she teased. I like things sweet, he muttered, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Ranger sat near the hearth, head on his paws, eyes following every move as though guarding something sacred. When the biscuits went into the oven, Clara wiped her hands on her apron. Jack leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. The cabin smelled like warmth, honey, vanilla, and something human that had been missing for far too long. Never thought I'd bake, he admitted. Never thought I'd survive a Montana winter, she said. Their eyes met. For a moment, the silence wasn't awkward, it was alive. Then the timer dinged and life moved again. Later that week, Jack fixed a roof. Clara watched from below as he balanced on the ladder, hammering nails with steady precision. He didn't need to do it. The leaks were small, but she realized he wanted to make things right. When he climbed down, covered in sawdust, she handed him a cup of hot cider. You didn't have to, she said. Didn't like the idea of you waking up to snow on your face, he answered simply. It was his way of saying I care without ever using the words. The day settled into a rhythm, quiet, simple, shared. They built a greenhouse behind the cabin using old glass panels Jack had salvaged from a junkyard. Clara planted herbs first, basil, rosemary, thyme, small stubborn things that clung to life even in the cold. Every morning she'd find Jack already there, adjusting the lamps, checking the soil. Ranger sat between them, his tail brushing both their boots, as if to keep the fragile connection alive. Sometimes, Clara would catch Jack watching her not with hunger, but with wonder, as though she were sunlight he'd forgotten existed. And sometimes, she'd look back, realizing she'd no longer feared the quiet. It had become theirs. That afternoon, the storm rolled in fast. The sky turned steel gray. Snow began to fall heavy and thick. The wind howled against the glass, and for a while the cabin shook as if the mountain itself was testing its strength. Jack brought in extra firewood, tossing logs into the hearth until the flames danced bright and tall. Clara brewed tea while Ranger curled near their feet. Outside, the world disappeared into white. Inside, everything glowed gold and soft. You know, Jack said after a long silence, his voice low, thoughtful, I used to think this place was just a box to keep me away from the world. Clara looked up, and now, he stared into the fire, the light painting his face in flickers of orange. Now it feels like something else. Like what? She asked. He turned toward her, eyes steady, voice almost a whisper. Like home. You make it feel that way. The words hit her deeper than she expected. Home. It was something she thought she'd lost the day her father slammed the door behind her. She swallowed, trying to find breath. I didn't mean to change anything. Maybe that's how change works, he said softly. It just happens. The flames cracked between them. Clara reached forward to adjust the log, her fingers brushing his. Neither of them moved away. Time slowed, just the hush of snow, the heartbeat of the fire, the warm, quiet space between two people learning what it meant to be seen again. He lifted his gaze. For a long second, he said nothing. Then slow, careful, like a man afraid the world might shatter, Jack leaned closer. Their lips met. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't desperate. It was the kind of kiss that begins as a question and ends as an answer, a promise written in breath and silence. When they finally parted, Clara could still taste the honey from that morning, and a faint trace of smoke from his shirt. He looked at her, really looked, and she saw the man behind all the scars. Not the soldier, not the stranger. Just Jack. You okay? He asked quietly. Yeah, she whispered. I think I finally am. Ranger sighed from the rug, as if in approval. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, there was warmth enough to outlast the winter. The thaw came slow that year. Snow still lay heavy on the ground, but the sunlight lasted longer each day, stretching over the cabin like a quiet promise. Clara woke one morning with a taste of iron in her mouth and a strange flutter low in her stomach. She thought it was the cold or the long days at work, but when the feeling came again, sharper, undeniable, something deep inside her shifted. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling against her nightdress. trying to breathe. Ranger lifted his head from the rug, ears perked as if he, too, could sense something new in the air. By the time Jack returned from the shed, Clara was standing near the window, pale as frost. "You okay?" he asked, setting down his gloves. She turned, eyes wide, voice barely more than a whisper. "Jack." I think she stopped, swallowed hard, then tried again. "I think I'm pregnant." For a long moment, there was no sound, not even the crackle of the fire. Jack stared at her, as though the words hadn't quite reached him yet. Then he blinked, once, twice, his breath catching in his throat. "You're sure?" I don't know, but it feels different. "I know my body, Jack. I know it." She laughed, then a soft, broken sound, equal parts wonder and disbelief. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling before she could stop them. "It can't be real. They said I couldn't. They said I never." Jack stepped forward, closing the space between them in 2 strides. He took her face in his hands, rough palms trembling against her skin. "They were wrong," he said, his voice low and fierce. "All of them, every single one of them." For the first time since she'd met him, Jack's eyes filled with tears. He laughed, a shaky, breathless sound that broke into something halfway between a sob and a smile. "They were wrong about you, Clara. They were wrong about what you deserve." She pressed her forehead against his chest, crying quietly, the steady beat of his heart grounding her. Ranger came closer, resting his head on her knee like a silent witness. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How can something like this happen?" "Maybe it's not about how," Jack said softly. "Maybe it's about why. Maybe this is what happens when life finally gets a second chance." He pulled back just enough to look at her, really look, and the expression on his face was something she would never forget. Not just pride, not just relief, but awe, pure and human. "You've brought life back to this place," he murmured. "To me." That night, Clara sat by the fire, one hand resting over the small curve of her belly. Jack sat beside her, close but quiet, as if afraid that words might break the fragile spell. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and thor. Inside, the flames danced soft and steady, throwing golden light across their faces. "What will we call her?" Clara asked after a while, her voice dreamy. Jack smiled faintly. "You already think it's a girl." "I just feel it," she said, "like she's been waiting, like she chose us." He considered that, gaze falling to her hand resting over her stomach. Then he said, slowly, "What about Ivy?" "Ivy, it's a stubborn little plant," he said with a quiet grin. "Grows even when nothing else does. Clings to life no matter how cold it gets." Clara smiled through fresh tears. "Ivy," she whispered. "It's perfect." They sat there a long time, saying the name to themselves, letting it settle in the air between them like a prayer. Days passed, and the world around them began to change. The snow melted in patches, revealing stubborn grass beneath. Birds returned to the trees. Clara's cheeks grew warmer, her step lighter. She hummed while cooking, while sweeping, while mending Jack's old shirts. Sometimes Jack caught her smiling for no reason, her hand unconsciously resting on her stomach. He never said it aloud, but every time he looked at her, something inside him loosened, a knot years old, tied tight by grief and guilt. At night, when the storms rumbled across the ridge, he'd wake to find her curled against him, her breathing steady, her warmth grounding him more than any dream ever could. One evening, he whispered to her sleeping form, "You saved me, Clara. You don't even know it." Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching, and Jack smiled faintly, whispering again, "Guess she saved you too." Old Boy the dog gave a quiet huff and laid his head back down. When Clara woke the next morning, sunlight streamed through the frost-glazed window, touching her face in gold. She turned to find Jack watching her, eyes soft with something she didn't need words for. "You look happy," he said. "I am," she replied, for the first time. "I really am." He reached out, brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek, and kissed her forehead. "Then we hold on to that," he said, "no matter what comes next." Outside, the first buds of spring fought their way through the snow. Inside, hope took root, quiet, strong, and unstoppable. And though they didn't say it aloud, both knew the miracle had come, not just to Clara's body, but to both their lives. The road into town was slick with melting snow, the kind that clung to the tires and whispered under the truck as it rolled downhill. Clara sat close to Jack, one hand resting on her belly, the other clutching the worn list she'd made the night before: diapers, blankets, bottles, a crib if they could find one. It had been months since she last saw the town, and though spring brushed color back into the hills, a knot of unease grew tighter with every mile they drove. "We'll be quick," Jack said, sensing her silence. "In and out," Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. When they pulled up outside the general store, a few townsfolk were already gathered near the porch. The chatter faded the moment the engine stopped. Eyes followed them as they stepped down the caked mud on Jack's boots. The small swirl beneath Clara's coat. She felt it immediately, that shift in the air, the weight of old whispers returning. Inside the store, the smell of pine soap and dust filled the air. Clara traced her fingers along a tiny knitted blanket folded on the counter. It was soft blue and white, and she could already picture it wrapped around little Ivy. But before she could say anything, she heard it. A woman's voice near the shelves. Then another, low, cutting, pretending not to be heard. Didn't think she'd show her face again. Guess she found herself another fool. Clara kept her eyes down. Jack, however, didn't. He turned toward the voices.com, but sharp, the kind of stillness that carried warning. The women pretended to busy themselves with jars and cans. Clara touched Jack's arm. "It's okay," she whispered. "Please." He didn't answer, just exhaled slowly, forcing himself back to quiet. They gathered what they needed, paid in silence. The cashier's smile was thin and quick, gone before Clara could return it. When they stepped back outside, a figure was waiting at the end of the porch, a woman in a long coat, her face pale, lips painted red. Emma. Clara froze. It had been nearly 2 years since she'd last seen her sister. Emma's smile came sharp and cold. "Well, if it isn't the miracle woman herself." Clara swallowed hard. "Emma, I didn't expect you, didn't expect me to recognize you." She cut in. "Hard to miss the woman the whole town's been talking about." Her gaze dropped to Clara's belly. "So it's true then, you and the soldier." Jack took a small step forward. "That's enough." Emma laughed, short and bitter. "Oh, don't worry, sir. I'm just surprised she found someone desperate enough to take her in. Everyone knows what she is." "Emma," Clara pleaded, voice breaking, "please don't." "Why not? Shouldn't he know? You were sold, Clara, thrown away because you couldn't give them a child. And now what? You think this little fantasy will change that?" The words hit harder than any slap. The crowd outside the butcher's shop had stopped to listen. Jack stepped between them, jaw tight, eyes steady. "You don't talk to her like that. Who are you to stop me?" Emma snapped. "Some broken soldier hiding in the woods." He took another step forward, not with anger, but something stronger, calm conviction that filled the air like thunder before the storm. "I'm her husband," he said clearly. "And that child you're sneering at," he pointed to Clara's belly, voice rising just enough to carry across the square. "That's our child. Ours, not yours, not theirs. And if anyone in this damn town has a problem with that, they can come say it to me." The silence that followed was deep and heavy. A dog barked somewhere down the street, the only sound brave enough to move. Emma's painted smile faltered, just slightly. Then she turned away, her heels crunching against the slush. "You'll regret coming back here," she muttered. "They all will." And just like that, she was gone. Clara stood frozen, breath shaking in her throat. Jack turned, placing a hand against her cheek. "Hey," he murmured, "look at me." Her eyes met his, filled with tears she didn't want to let fall. "She hates me," Clara whispered. "They all do." "Then let them," Jack said softly. "Let them talk, let them choke on their own stories. You don't owe them anything." He brushed away her tears with his thumb. "We go home. That's what we do." Clara nodded, but as they climbed back into the truck, she looked out the window one last time. The faces in the street hadn't softened. People still stared, still whispered. By the time they reached the curve of the mountain road, she was quiet again. Ranger rested his head on her lap, sensing her sorrow. Jack kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other reaching over to find hers. Their fingers intertwined, rough skin against soft, steady and unspoken. "They can say what they want," he said, eyes fixed on the winding road, "but they'll never take what's real." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time since they'd driven into town, she felt safe again. Outside, the mountains rose tall and silent, like sentinels guarding what was theirs, and beneath that endless sky, Clara whispered to the child growing inside her, "You're loved. No matter what they say, you're loved." The first sign came with the sound of church bells. They didn't ring for worship that Sunday, they rang for warning. Down in the valley, smoke rose above Evergreen Hollow, curling like dark fingers against the pale sky. The air itself seemed uneasy, thick with something that didn't belong to winter. Clara stood by the cabin window, one hand over her belly, watching that thin gray column. Ranger wind softly at her side. "Jack," she whispered, "do you see it?" Jack was already outside, coat half-buttoned, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The wind tore through the trees, carrying faint voices too distant to make out, but enough to chill his blood. He lowered the glass, jaw tight. "They're coming." "Who?" "Your father." he said quietly, and half the damn town. The rumor had started the day after they left town that the child in Clara's womb was not of this world, that no barren woman could suddenly conceive without intervention, and when Reverend Harlan took the pulpit that Sunday, his words poured like poison. The Lord warns of false miracles, he'd said, voice booming through the rafters. A woman cursed now claims to be blessed. A man broken by war harbors her in sin. This he'd pointed toward the mountains. This is not of God. The people listened. They always did. And Henry Rivers, his pride twisted into hatred. We gathered them afterward. She's lost, he said, but we can still save her soul. We'll bring her home. They didn't bring Bibles or prayers. They brought rifles and kerosene. Back on the ridge, Jack moved with the calm precision of an old soldier. He loaded shells into his shotgun, checked the bolt on the rifle, then went to the cellar door hidden beneath the kitchen rug. There's food down here, he said, voice steady enough for a week. Water too, if they come this far, Jack. No, Clara grabbed his sleeve. You're not staying up here. Someone has to. Please, we can run. There's still time. He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, the mask of control slipped. She saw the fear beneath it, the sorrow, the fierce love. If we run, he said softly, they'll follow. They'll never stop. But if I make them think I'm still here, Clara shook her head, tears breaking free. I can't lose you. He cupped her face in his rough, cold hands. You won't. For a heartbeat, the world went quiet. Snow fell outside like ashes. Ranger pressed his muzzle between them, sensing the storm in their hearts. Take him with you, Jack said. He'll keep you safe. Ranger barked once, low and reluctant, as if refusing the command. Go with her. Boy, Jack ordered, voice breaking slightly. That's an order. The dog's ears flattened. He didn't move. Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Stubborn damn soldier. Clara almost smiled through the tears. You taught him well, she whispered. By afternoon, the sky turned the color of bruised steel. The wind carried the faintest scent of kerosene. Jack could see movement now, a cluster of men climbing through the snow-laden pines, torches flickering against the gray. He could make out his father-in-law's heavy stride, the Reverend's black coat flapping behind him. They were shouting something, words twisted by distance, but the rage was clear enough. He crouched near the woodpile, rifle balanced on his knee. His breath fogged the air. Inside the cabin, Clara moved quietly, lowering herself into the cellar, heart pounding. Every creak of the floor above made her flinch. Ranger stayed by her side, muscles tense, ears alert. She whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for him. The first torch landed against the porch. Flames hissed and sputtered in the snow, refusing to take. Henry Rivers stepped forward, voice raw with anger. Jack Donovan, send her out. You don't know what you're sheltering. Jack rose slowly from behind the woodpile. His voice was calm, but it carried across the clearing like the crack of frost. You take one more step, and you'll find out exactly who I am. She's my daughter. Then you should have treated her like one. For a moment, no one moved. Even the Reverend hesitated. Then one of the younger men, nervous, drunk on righteous fury, lifted his torch again. The rifle thundered once. The torch flew from his hand, falling harmlessly into the snow. Next one goes higher, Jack said. They faltered. The line wavered. Henry's face twisted in rage. He's threatening us. He's armed. I'm protecting my home. Jack shot back. You've got no right here. The Reverend stepped forward, his voice trembling with zeal. You can't fight God's will, son. Then he'd better stay out of my sights. The standoff hung in the frozen air. Then the wind shifted hard and fast, snuffing out several torches. A wall of snow came rolling down from the ridge, small but sudden, scattering men off their feet. Jack took it as his chance. He fired once more into the air, a warning, a roar. Get off my mountain, he bellowed. They broke. Fear outweighed fury. The Reverend stumbled back, shouting prayers into the storm, while Henry's curses vanished in the wind. When the last shadow disappeared into the valley, Jack dropped to his knees in the snow. His rifle hung limp in his hands. He'd protected her. For now, inside the cellar, Clara heard the echoes fade. Ranger barked once, a question. Jack opened the door, face pale but steady. It's over, he whispered. Clara climbed into his arms, shaking, crying into his chest. They won't stop, she said. You know they won't. Then we don't either, he replied. Outside, the snow kept falling, slow, soft, endless. And in that fragile silence between breaths, the fire in their hearts burned brighter than the flames men carried in hate. The storm came before dawn. Wind howled through the bitterroot pines like a living thing, slamming against the cabin walls. Snow blew sideways, a white curtain swallowing the world. The fire in the hearth flickered madly, throwing restless shadows across the room. Clara was on the floor by the couch, clutching her belly. Her breath came sharp, shallow. "Jack," her voice cracked. It's happening." Jack froze mid-step, the rifle half cleaned on the table. His mind snapped from soldier to husband in an instant. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Breathe, Clara. Just breathe for me." Ranger barked from near the door, ears sharp, tail rigid, torn between guarding and helping. A thunderclap rolled over the mountain, muffled by snow. Outside, the world was nothing but white chaos. Minutes blurred into hours or maybe seconds. Time lost meaning. Jack boiled water, tore sheets into strips, his hands trembling despite years of battlefield steadiness. Clara cried out again, gripping his arm so tightly her nails drew blood. "You're doing good," he whispered, wiping sweat from her brow. "You're the bravest damn thing I've ever seen." She shook her head, tears mixing with the sweat. I can't do this." "Yes, you can," he said, voice breaking. "You already are." The storm screamed outside like a warning. Ranger growled low, pacing by the door. Something was out there, movement beneath the wind's roll. Jack's eyes darted toward the window, catching faint flashes of light in the trees. Flashlights. They had come back. Clara gasped. "Please don't leave me." He pressed his forehead to hers for one long, desperate second. "I'm not leaving, not yet." He kissed her quickly, rough, trembling, then reached for his rifle, sliding around into the chamber. Ranger growled again. The lights were closer now, cutting through the blizzard. Voices carried on the wind, distorted but unmistakable. "Up here, I see smoke." Jack cursed under his breath. "Damn it, not now." He turned back to Clara, her face pale, slick with sweat, her eyes wide with both pain and fear. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "You're almost there. You hear me? Almost." "Jack, no." "You look at me." His eyes burned with something fierce and eternal. "You bring that little girl into this world. I don't care what it takes. You do that, and I'll handle the rest." A scream tore from her throat as another contraction hit. Jack caught her shoulders, guided her breathing. The fire flared, crackling loud, echoing her cries, and then a sound unlike any other. A wail, soft at first, then strong, alive. Jack froze. The rifle slipped slightly in his grip. His eyes went wide with something close to awe. "She's here," Clara sobbed. "Jack, she's here." He looked down at the tiny bundle in her trembling hands. A small face, red and furious, fists waving weakly at the cold air. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. "You did it," he whispered, voice trembling. "You brought her home." He wrapped the baby carefully in a flannel blanket, hands shaking like he was holding something made of light. "Hey there, Ivy," he murmured. "Welcome to the world, sweetheart." For a moment, the storm didn't exist, only firelight and the fragile heartbeat of new life. Then glass shattered. A gunshot cracked through the night. Wood splintered near the window. Ranger lunged to the door, snarling. Jack grabbed his rifle, swinging it up. "No," Clara whispered, clutching Ivy tight. "Please don't go." He looked back at her. That same calm returned, a soldier's calm, but behind it, love burned like a second fire. "Ranger will take you down the ravine," he said. "Follow the creek till you see the old bridge. Keep moving. Don't stop." "Jack, please don't argue." His voice cracked once, then steadied. "You and her, you're everything I've got left. Don't let me lose you too." He bent down, kissed Ivy's forehead so gently it almost wasn't there, then pressed his lips to Clara's. "Don't look back," he whispered. "Promise me." Clara shook her head through tears. "I love you." He smiled, small, broken, full of warmth. "Then that's enough." He stood, rifle in hand, shoulders squared. Ranger stayed by the door, whining, torn. "Go," Jack ordered softly. "Guard her." Ranger hesitated, then obeyed. He nudged Clara toward the back door, barking once, sharp and urgent. She slipped into the blinding snow, baby cradled against her chest, her breath coming in sobs. The wind swallowed her figure almost instantly. Jack turned toward the front. The door shook under the pounding fists outside. "Donovan," a voice shouted, "give her up." He chambered another round. "Over my dead body." The door burst inward. A flash of torchlight, a scream, a gunshot. The world erupted into thunder. He fired once, twice. Men fell. Shadows leaped across the walls. The smell of gunpowder mixed with smoke and pine. He moved like a ghost, steady, deliberate, unflinching. For every shot that rang out, another voice fell silent. Then silence. Only the storm remained, whispering through broken glass. Far below, Clara stumbled through the snow, Ranger circling her protectively. Ivy's cries were faint against the roar of the wind. Then she heard it faint but clear. Gunfire, a single shot, then another, then nothing. Clara fell to her knees, sobbing into the storm. "Jack," she whispered, "please come back." The wind carried her voice into the dark, up the mountain, through the smoke, to the man who'd stayed behind. And somewhere within that endless storm, a single echo answered, not words, not sound, just the whisper of love that refuses to die. Morning came like a whisper. The storm had passed, but the world it left behind was silent and white, a graveyard made of snow and broken trees. The wind no longer screamed. It sighed, soft and tired, carrying the smell of smoke and pine through the frozen air. Clara climbed the ridge slowly, her boots sinking deep into the drifts. Ivy slept in her arms, bundled in blankets, her tiny breath warm against Clara's chest. Ranger walked ahead, limping, nose low to the ground, tracing a path through what was left of the night. The cabin appeared at last, half buried in snow, windows shattered, smoke still curling weakly from the chimney. The door hung crooked on its hinges. The silence there was heavier than the cold. Jack. Clara's voice broke the stillness. No answer. She took another step, then another, heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. Ranger barked once, short and low, the kind of bark that wasn't alarm but recognition. He darted forward, paws crunching through the ice. Clara followed, stumbling into the open doorway. Inside, the cabin looked like a place caught between war and miracle. Bullet holes peppered the walls, blood streaked the floorboards. Drying dark against the wood, the rifle lay on the table, empty, surrounded by spent shells, and against the far wall, half slumped, half sitting, was Jack. He was pale as the snow outside, coat torn, one shoulder soaked through with blood. His head rested against the wall, eyes closed. For a terrible second, she thought she was too late. Then his chest rose shallow, ragged, but alive. "Jack," she whispered, falling to her knees beside him. His eyelids fluttered open. The faintest ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Told you I'd handle it," he rasped, voice rough as gravel. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could speak. She pressed Ivy into his good arm. The baby stirred, let out a soft cry. Jack looked down, eyes glassy with pain and wonder. "Hey there, little one," he murmured. "Looks like you made it." "We all did," Clara said through her tears. "Because of you." He shook his head weakly. "Because of us." Outside, the world glimmered under the first gold light of dawn. Smoke rose lazily from the remains of torches half buried in snow. Down the slope, faint tracks led away, the mob retreating in silence, their anger frozen into shame. They hadn't spoken a word when they left. There was nothing left to say. The Reverend's Bible lay open near the gate, pages fluttering in the breeze, a verse about mercy half buried in snow. Clara tore strips from a clean sheet, pressing them gently against Jack's wound. He winced but didn't complain. Ranger settled beside him, head resting on his boot, tail twitching once before stilling. The fire had burned low, just embers now. She fed it, kindling with trembling hands until warmth began to return to the room. Jack's eyes wandered between her and the baby, a faint smile tugging his lips. "Guess this place ain't so quiet anymore." Clara laughed softly, brokenly. "No," she said, "it finally feels alive." He looked at her for a long time, as if memorizing her face, every tear, every breath. "You were the miracle, Clara," he whispered. "Not her, you." She pressed her forehead to his, closing her eyes. "No," she breathed. "We both were." The day brightened slowly, touching the cabin walls with light. Ranger gave a small whine and shifted closer, curling between them like a sentry at rest. Clara stroked the dog's fur, whispering, "Good boy, it's over now." Ivy stirred again, her tiny hand clutching at the air before brushing against Jack's coat. He caught her fingers with his eyes soft, full of life even through the pain. "She's strong," he murmured, "like her mother, and stubborn," Clara added. "Like her father." They both laughed, quiet, exhausted, beautiful outside. The snow began to fall again, not with fury, but peace. Each flake melted as it touched the window pane, like the sky itself was exhaling. The storm was gone. In its place was something stronger, the fragile, burning kind of hope that only survives after everything else has been stripped away. Ranger sighed once content, his tail thumping weakly against the floorboards before going still again. And in that small cabin on the mountain, surrounded by ash and light, the three of them, man, woman, child, breathed together, alive. The years came quietly, like new snow over old scars. The cabin stood where it always had, halfway up the ridge, surrounded by whispering pines and the faint shimmer of frost. The roof had been patched a dozen times, the windows replaced with glass Jack cut by hand, but it still creaked when the wind leaned against it. Time didn't erase what happened to you. It simply softened the edges. Ivy was 6 now, all fire and laughter, with hair the color of late autumn and eyes that mirrored both her parents. She ran barefoot through the yard, chasing flakes that danced in the sunlight. "Ranger, come on," she called. The old German shepherd rose stiffly from his spot by the porch. His muzzle was silver now, eyes cloudy, but his tail wagged at the sound of her voice. He followed her with patient loyalty, every step careful but determined. Jack watched them from the garden, his hands deep in the soil. The years had given him a limp and a few more lines across his face, but his eyes were still steady, the same calm that once stared down a mob in a snowstorm. He was planting again a young pine tree, its roots wrapped in burlap. Clara had said they should stop, that the ground was too hard this time of year. But Jack only smiled. If something's meant to grow, he'd told her, it'll find a way. He pressed the soil around the sapling, straightened up, and wiped his hands on his jeans. From where he stood he could see Clara through the window, sitting at the old wooden table, papers spread out before her, pen moving slowly but deliberately. Her book, it had taken her years to find the courage to write it, a collection of stories about people the world had cast aside. The broken, the misunderstood, the unforgiven, and though she never said it out loud, both she and Jack knew the last story was theirs. Sometimes, on clear days, smoke still rose from the chimneys down in Evergreen Hollow. The town had rebuilt after that winter, though not all its wounds had healed. The church still stood, its bell rusted but intact. Reverend Harlan had left long ago, no one knew where. Henry Rivers had passed the next spring, his name carved into a stone that few visited, and the people of the town, they whispered still, though softer now. Some said the couple on the mountain practiced dark rituals. Others said they'd seen strange lights in the woods at night, but no one ever climbed up to check. The mountain had become a boundary between fear and forgiveness. Clara stepped out onto the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She watched Jack tamp down the soil, then looked to where Ivy and Ranger played in the snow. Ivy was building something, a small fort made of snow and twigs. Ranger lay beside it, guarding it like a fortress. "You two building a castle," Clara called out. "It's not a castle," Ivy said, giggling. "It's home for the snow fairies." Jack chuckled under his breath. "Guess she gets that from you." Clara smiled softly. "No," she said, "she gets that from us." She came down the steps and stood beside him, slipping her hand into his. His fingers were rough, warm even in the cold. They stood together in silence, watching their daughter spin in the falling snow. The years had taken much youth, strength, certainty, but they had left something far more enduring: peace. Later, when the light began to fade, Clara returned inside. She sat at her desk, the lantern burning low, and opened her journal. She could hear Ivy humming to herself in the next room, Ranger's slow breathing, Jack's boots creaking across the floor as he brought in another log for the fire. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft, endless, eternal. She dipped her pen into ink and began to write. "They called us the cursed. They said the mountain would claim us, that our love was a sin against heaven, but heaven never came for us. The snow did." Her pen paused. She looked out the window, past her reflection, toward the ridge where Jack's pine tree swayed gently in the wind. "Maybe they were right," she whispered. "Maybe we were cursed." A pause, a breath. "But if love is a curse, then let it be one we bear gladly." She smiled faintly and closed the notebook, the ink still wet. Jack appeared at the doorway, leaning against the frame. "Writing another ending?" he asked. "No," she said, looking up at him. "Just the truth." He nodded, then crossed the room to stand behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. Outside, Ivy's laughter echoed through the snow. The storm that had once nearly killed them had given them everything they now had. Clara turned toward the window one last time. Snow was falling thick again, the world fading into white. Her voice, soft but certain, filled the room, a whisper meant for no one but the mountains. "They called us the cursed," she said. "But if love, this kind of love, is a sin," she looked out at the endless, falling snow, "then let the snow cover it forever." The wind stirred the curtains. The fire cracked once, warm and alive, and outside, under the pale silver sky, a child's laughter rang clear, a sound so pure, it felt like forgiveness. The snow kept falling, and the mountain kept their secret.